In this video, I call into a Christian call center pretending to be an atheist and then actually manage to completely stump the guy that answered.
Let me think a little bit on that one. Yeah, I'm not sure how to respond to that.
Okay, but before we get to the call, let me just quickly tell you how the idea for this video actually came about, because it's kind of interesting. Every road trip that our family takes in Texas, we see these huge billboards on the side of the road that say things like, "There is evidence for God." And every time I see them, I think I want to call in and pretend to be like an atheist, like a philosophically informed atheist, and just like see what happens. And I mean, we no longer have to wonder. Okay, now the point of this video is not to actually make fun of call centers or the guy that answered. I think he was actually super nice. He did, I think, the best that he could. But the point of this video is that we Christians should be thinking way, way deeper about objections to our faith. You got to stick around until the end of this video, because I invite my super smart philosopher friend and caveman, Pat Flynn, to respond to my atheist twin objections at the end of this phone call. As someone who thinks super deeply about his faith, he was able to answer what the call center could not. But if you want to know how to answer atheist, gotta stay tuned. Here is my very interesting phone call as an atheist with a Christian call center. All right, here we go. Let's do this. 83FORTRUTH. Calling now.
Thank you for calling the toll-free number for gospelbillboards.org.
For English, press 1.
Para español, marque tres. To speak with someone on our phone team about your questions or spiritual needs, press 0. Para español. If you know the extension number of the phone team member you would like to speak with, you may dial it at any time. This call may be monitored or recorded.
Please listen to a brief explanation of truth while we connect your call. Have you ever...
Good morning. Thank you for calling 83 for Truth. Daniel speaking.
Hi, Daniel. I have some questions.
I'll try to answer them for you. Go ahead.
I'm an atheist, so I don't think that any God exists. I can maybe share some reasons why I think that's the case, why I don't think there are any gods. What do you think?
Well, I guess we look at things, look at evidence around us with a different worldview. I believe there is a God, and one of the reasons I believe there is, I see his footprints all over nature, his handiwork. Just like when we see a car or a cell phone, we know that somebody created that because there's order and reality to it, and it runs, and they operate the way the manufacturer wants them to run. Well, most of the time. But the universe has run for many, many years, and it's still out there functioning. We believe it's a product of an orderly mind, and we believe that mind is in God himself. The Bible tells us in Romans 1 verse 20, I believe it is, that the things that about God can be understood through the things that are made. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. He's talking about the people that have never heard the Bible. So that's one of the reasons I believe that there is a God.
Do you mind if I share a couple reasons why I think that God does not exist?
Yes, go ahead. It's probably nothing new. We talk to atheists on a regular basis, but go ahead. I'd like to hear your thinking.
Okay, so there are two main reasons. One of the first reason is that it just seems simpler. We know that the universe exists. We know that natural things exist, but the believers in God are adding on to that hypothesis, adding something to that, namely God or gods or some sort of divine agent on top of what we for sure know exists. And so it just seems a bit simpler to posit no God in order to explain the way that the world is. So that's one reason, and I'll get you to comment on that in just a second. But the second reason, and this one, I'm sure you've heard it before, is the problem of evil. The amount of suffering in the world that we see, the amount of languishing, the animal suffering in the world just seems a little bit too much, seems gratuitous, as some philosophers have put it. That's probably the main reason that I don't believe in God. I think it's, well, A, like I said, I think it's simpler. But then B, when I look around the world, like, sure, there are some things that seem pretty amazing, but then I get struck by the amount of suffering in the world, and that just doesn't seem like what a perfectly loving, perfectly good God would want or would want to create. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, well, you're exactly right about God not wanting to create evil. And so we need to go back to the creation account in the Bible, and it says that God created everything good. And that when evil came into the world, then sin and sickness and death came along with the disobedience to the plan that God had given to Adam and Eve. God created with a free will. God created man with a free will. You have free will. You can decide. You can plan. You can do basically what you want to do, and God doesn't necessarily interfere with that. And so the same is true with evil. God has provided a way that we can be free from sin and from evil, but that doesn't affect everybody, because not everybody chooses that way. And so we have evil in our world. But
Is it your view that God knew?
The question I ask an atheist: how do you decide what is evil and what is good?
Well, I think those are actually necessary truths, but I want to get back to what you said earlier. It seems implicit in your response that the good of this life, what we see now, there is evil in the world, but there are other good things. It sort of seems implicit in your response that because God, I think we both agree, if there is a God, then that God would have to be all-knowing, right? So he knew what was going to happen. And so prior to making that choice, he would have had to known, hey, if I do this, it's going to lead to a lot of bad stuff, but it's going to be worth it somehow. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Well, I think yes, I do believe that he knew the future, and he decided when he made the creation that this is the way he's going to create it. And
right.
People can choose. And so...
But so implicit in that answer is that it's worth it. So it's God knew what would happen. He knew that all this bad stuff would result in tsunamis that kill 250,000 people, the Lisbon earthquake, or the Lisbon fires that killed 50,000 people in these horrendous fires. There's all sorts of, well, I don't think that you guys necessarily believe in millions of years of evolution, but even now, on the timeline that we're in now, even if young earth creationism is true, that's still thousands of years of animals suffering, being torn to shreds. So what you've got to do is you've got to say, well, from God's point of view, that is all worth it. It's all good. It was worth it in the end because we gave humans the freedom to choose. And that to me is questionable. Why would you think that that's so valuable? Why would God see that as so valuable given how bad the stuff is that we see in the world? There's murders, there's horrendous things, evils that are done to humans. Yeah, what is your reason for thinking that all of it is worth it?
Well, so there's several reasons. God created humans with an ability to communicate with him. He wanted, of course, as any person who has developed anything, he wanted humans to live the way that he designed for them to live, and that would be worth it. Now they chose, and
well, hang on a second. I'm not exactly seeing how that's worth it.
But you're asking, how did God see that all that was worth it? And so I'm not sure that I can totally answer that question, because I'm not God. I serve him because I love him, because I feel that his way and the way he designed for us to live is the best way to live.
But you see how that can seem a little bit unsatisfactory to someone like me, because I don't have a relationship with God. I don't know just sort of innately that it's all worth it. And so when I look at the world, I think, man, this bad stuff is really, really bad. And I just don't know that it is worth it. And so from my perspective, as an atheist, I think, well, the most rational view is that there is no God. And it sounds to me like you don't necessarily have a response to that.
Well, we can respond that way because we don't understand. But from my viewpoint, that denies a lot of evidence that there is a God.
Well, let me give you maybe an analogy that might help. So if I've got kids, if I were to go and give my son, he's 6 years old, if I were to go and give him a really sharp knife, I gave him the freedom to do that, that would be bad on my part. Like that would be that would mean that I'm not a loving father if I just gave him, and we can even increase the example and make it worse. If I gave him a loaded gun and I said, here, go have some fun. That would be a bad decision on my part. That's not a decision that I would make as a good parent. And so in a similar way, you might say, well, it wasn't right on God's part to just give us this freedom to be able to make these horrible choices. So I don't know that the free will type response is going to do kind of what you need it to do here.
Well, it doesn't explain, I'll grant you, it doesn't explain everything. And yet, God loved us enough that he made a way for us. He made a way for all humans to understand him, to not everything, because we're human. He's divine. I can't understand everything about God. Christians throughout ages would definitely prefer not to have suffering come into their lives the way it is. Even people that don't believe there's a God would prefer that. But the fact that we have a way into eternity with him and of total freedom, we will be totally free from all of this, shows that God did love, even though he gave us the freedom to hurt ourselves.
Well, do you believe in universalism? Do you believe that everyone will be saved?
No, because not everybody is choosing that.
Well, that seems to me like to be a problem with the response that you just gave, where you're kind of pointing at heaven as a sort of compensation for the bads that we experience here on earth. But if not everyone gets into heaven, then not everyone is going to get that sort of compensation. So then it leaves open the people that are still, that are, well, the ungodly that go to hell. So that doesn't help them at all. You're back at the same initial question of free will. Is the freedom to choose to love God or not to choose, or to choose not to love God, is that really worth it in the end? And if someone, that a lot of people point out that actually makes the problem worse. Like if you've got people living for an infinite amount of time in suffering in hell, that seems like a pretty bad thing. I don't know, man. I'm just not buying it.
Yeah. Well, again, you have the choice, and maybe I'm saying that too often. But the fact that God created us and loved us, and when Adam and Eve sinned and turned against him, see, they lived in a perfect world, except for choice. We're here to offer the way of salvation, the way of peace, and the way of freedom from sin and the curse of sin. It's not to say we won't suffer. Yes, we will suffer. We all know that. That's part of life, part of death. And yet, yes, I believe God thought it was worth it to create man.
Well, go back to the analogy that I gave. Suppose that I gave my son a gun, loaded gun, and he went out and killed 4 or 5 people. would it make much sense to go, well, it was worth it because I gave him a free choice?
Well, God doesn't. Okay, God does give us the freedom to choose to sin. That's true.
Yes.
And
But could I use that same response if someone said, "You're a bad father. You gave him a loaded gun. That's bad. You're not a loving parent because of that." And then I said, "Well, I gave him the freedom to choose."
Mm-hmm. No, I don't think it. I don't think it comes out. I don't think that's the same thing. Let me think a little bit on that one. Yeah, I'm not sure how to respond to that. I don't think it's the same as me as a finite person putting the temptation to choose wrong in front of another person. I don't think that's what God is doing.
Well, what God is doing is He's giving us the freedom to choose, and I'm basically giving an analogy along the same lines, where I'm giving my son the freedom to choose to do whatever he wills with a loaded weapon, which is similar to what God has done with us, where He's given us, we're not infinite in our capacities, but we have enough that we can do to where we can cause some really bad things. So in a similar way, I give my son enough capacity to make some really bad decisions. I can't go then and back and try to justify it by saying, well, I just, it's worth it because I gave him the free will to choose.
But God also gave us the way and the freedom to choose what is right.
True, just like my son could go out and not kill anyone, but if he does go out and kill people, which we have a number of examples of horrible, horrible, horrible things happening in the real world, then I would be held accountable. And again, God is omniscient. God knows. God knew that bad stuff would happen.
Yes, that's true.
Do you mind if I reveal something to you?
No, go ahead.
I'm actually a Christian YouTuber. I plan on breaking this conversation down with a philosopher friend of mine who's going to respond to some of the objections that I raised here. These are all very deep philosophical questions, but I really appreciate you helping me out and doing what you can to answer some of these questions. They're deep and difficult questions, that's for sure. What was your name again? Daniel?
My name is Daniel.
Yeah.
So how do you, as a Christian, then break it down?
I agree. That is a very, very good question. So after recording this phone call, I actually sent the conversation to my friend Pat Flynn, as I mentioned earlier, to see how he would respond to the objections that I raised during the call. So here's my conversation with writer, philosopher, podcaster, speaker, friend, caveman, Pat Flynn. All right, Pat, it's great to have you here. So what were your overall thoughts or impressions of the conversation that you just heard?
It's great to be here, Cameron. I can't believe it took us this long to finally have a chat. I thought the phone call was good. I mean, you brought some powerful objections. They're the sort of things that a sophisticated atheist, I think, would rationally bring up if they're really looking to challenge the theistic worldview. One other thing I liked about the conversation is it was friendly. So, no matter how conversations go, I just like when there's a general friendly demeanor and there seems to be a fruitful exchange of ideas. So yeah, I thought it was good. I thought you brought some tough challenges, and I'm excited to have the opportunity to take a whack at some of them.
Yeah, so let's start maybe with the first thing that I said. And Daniel and I didn't really get too deep into this. So how would you respond to the claim that I made about atheism being sort of a more simple hypothesis?
Yeah, this is complicated. I have a chapter in my book called Simplicity It's Complicated, because when it comes to theory selection, simplicity is one of those theoretical virtues that is really supposed to be a sort of tiebreaker. So it's not like the ultimate thing, right? Simplicity considerations really only come in when we have kind of two theories that seem to be on an explanatory par. If you have one theory that's clearly a better, explanatory account of things, then you'll just go with that and simplicity won't be a big deal. But if you have two theories that you think are kind of in a dead heat, then we need to start thinking about the sort of internal complexity to a theory. And the reason this is complicated is because philosophers don't agree on like where and how simplicity matters. But here's what I think. I think simplicity matters most on the fundamental level. So it's not about like how many things do you have in your worldview overall, but rather how simple is your fundamental posit, your fundamental entity. And if you go with me on that, then I think theism turns out pretty good. I think it's actually going to be hard for an atheist to match theism with respect to that sort of simplicity. Why? Because if you're a classical theist, you think that there's just one fundamental entity. It's a very unified theory, and that entity either has one or zero properties, depending on how you sort of conceptualize it. So I think at best, to be modest, a naturalist theory could maybe tie with theism. But I think most naturalist theories actually that are out there being presented by atheists are obviously more complicated on the fundamental level.
Good stuff to think about. All right, let's move on to another objection that I gave. Basically, how would you respond to the analogy that I gave about giving my son the freedom to handle a loaded weapon?
Yeah, so sometimes theists respond to the problem of evil with the idea that free will is a really valuable thing. It's good for us to have for various reasons. And there's different accounts of this. Richard Swinburne seems to like to focus on the value of free will and the value of being able to make like really morally significant decisions. He even says that this is something that is sort of unique to us, that God can't even have sort of freedom in this sense because God doesn't have the ability to sin, right? There's, I guess, something to that. I'm not a huge fan of that approach. I think it's a little metaphysically messed up, right? And here's why. I think the fundamental thing that is valuable, that is good, and that is worth creating are human beings, us. And I think that we just are by nature rational animals. So there's not like something that is us, and then you could like sprinkle free will on top. There's just us. And when you analyze what we are metaphysically as rational animals, it turns out that it's essential to us that we have intellect and will. And what will is just the rational appetite. And for beings like us, we have the power to consider, the space of concepts, to contingently determine ourselves along certain courses of action. Traditionally, the will is really just the power to end deliberation. That's what the will is. It's the power to say, I choose you to a set of reasons for a particular course of action. And that's inherent, that's essential to rational animals. So there's no like us without this power. The problem is that this power for us is fallible. Within the classical theistic tradition, there's only one being that is absolutely perfect. There's only one being that is its own end, which is God. Every other being sort of has to look beyond itself and consider moral principles and moral rules as it sort of moves towards its final perfection. And it's just a case, I think, of metaphysical necessity that we can fail. We can engage in culpable ignorance. We can sin and we can introduce massive amounts of disorder into the world. So I think that's the better way to frame it, because then you don't have to say that, free will is a valuable thing. You just have to say that we are a valuable thing. And this is sort of a necessary consequence of creating beings like us. And I think we are a very valuable thing. I think we are worth creating, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really helpful response. And you also kind of go into that in your book as well, which we'll talk about a little bit more in just a second. But is that kind of how you would approach the problem of evil, at least the version that I gave with Daniel in my conversation?
Yeah, no, I actually have a lot more to say about the problem of evil, and it's an enormous topic, and I want to be respectful of that topic, because I think just giving too quick of an answer is a little cheap. It can be dissatisfying. But let me give a general sketch of how I would respond to the greater problem, and for people who are interested, they can see my book or other academic work on this. So first off, remember, we're talking about theory comparison, right? So like how well does... I like to focus on suffering, right? The data of suffering, the types of suffering, the distribution of suffering. How well does naturalism, which is your philosophically developed form of atheism, explain that? That's the first question we have to ask, versus how well does classical or traditional theism explain that? Now, the first thing I want to do is I want to try and take a little wind out of the naturalist sails, because I don't think when you take a substantial look at the matter, that naturalism actually has a really great explanation of suffering. In fact, I don't think naturalism really has an explanation of suffering at all. But to see why is a little bit complicated. So let me just, again, give this sketch. So naturalists are generally committed to the idea of source physicalism, right? And the idea here is that the physical realm precedes the mental realm. And the mental realm is that qualitative dimension. It's the realm of feelings and stuff like that, right? So the naturalist is going to say that the physical, comes before the mental, and it causes the mental, right? What's really doing all the work, including the work that we do, our movements and our feelings and our thoughts, are the mindless physical interactions underneath, right? And this leads many naturalists, not all, but many naturalists, to be epiphenomenalists. Now, that's a fancy term, and epiphenomena is just something that is caused, but itself causes nothing, right? So it's this sort of byproduct or foam that kind of floats atop these underlying, physical states or events or what have you. So that's how a lot of naturalists see the mental realm. They see it as an epiphenomena. It has no causal relevance, right? And this is significant to the problem of suffering, because if the feeling of something like pain isn't what is responsible for me avoiding dangerous or damaging things, then we don't actually have an explanation for why pain is there, for why the feeling is there. It seems completely unnecessary, right? And not only that, but if it's the physical events, the physical interactions that matter, that get my joints into the right spot. And mind you, evolution isn't a good solution here, because evolution selects for physical outcomes, not necessarily feelings. And we're saying there's an essential divide here that creates a problem for the naturalist, right? So really, the feelings didn't need to be there at all, or they could have been really anything. When I hit my hand against a hot stove, as long as the physical interactions get my joints in the right place, I could have the feeling that I have when I hear the Barney theme song. It doesn't matter, because it's just causally irrelevant, right? So once you appreciate that fine point, which is kind of deep into naturalistic philosophies of mind, you realize, oh man, on the surface, it seemed like naturalism had a good explanation, because naturalism is committed to this idea of indifference, right? But once you get into the weeds, I think you start to see there's some really serious difficulties here. And I'll just say, for people who understand that naturalist philosophies of mind vary, in my book, I show how I think this is a structural problem, whether you take reductive functionalism or something like that too, but I'll leave that to the side. So that's point one. Cameron, if you want to chime in.
Yeah, no, man, I can't wait to actually chime in on this, because I've been saying this for so long, and not exactly in the way that you've said it here, but I think that naturalism has a really tough job, and I think that it applies to atheism as well, really tough job in trying to explain why there's so much suffering in the world. It's sort of taken as a given, like, oh, this is exactly what we'd expect given naturalism or given atheism. And I just have never understood why people claim that, because on naturalism, it doesn't seem like we'd expect. So before we can have any sort of suffering, we've got to have at least some sort of form of consciousness there, like you said. But under naturalism or atheism, it doesn't seem like that even follows or is expected or is entailed. And this is because of things like the fine-tuning argument, where we're looking at what likelihood is it that given naturalism, we're actually going to have a world with order, with rational creatures, or even creatures that can respond to different stimuli and stuff. When we're talking about like the animals and stuff, like it just, it blows my, I don't understand why naturalists are so eager to just claim, and that's really all that it is. It's just a big claim that naturalism predicts all of this suffering. So I'm very much on board with the overall point that you're getting here, where naturalists, man, they've got a lot more work to do.
Let me build on that a little bit, right? So what you're talking about are what I would consider logically prior hurdles, right? To even get to the data of suffering, it seems like you already have to get through the problem of conscious beings, which is a serious problem for the naturalists. In fact, I have that in my book. I argue that consciousness, not just that, but rationality as well, I think they're distinct, are much better expected on theism. I think they should seriously lower anyone's confidence in naturalism. So maybe by the time you get to suffering, you already think that naturalism is just kind of disqualified, right? It's eliminated, or your confidence or credence in it is so low. However, I also want to say that, okay, if you do just grant the naturalists those things and say that they're still in the explanatory race, then you still do need to give an account of suffering. And the naturalists say, okay, well, maybe you got me on consciousness, but I got you on conscious beings and they suffer, right? So that's why I'm trying to push it further and say, no, even there, even there, the distribution of suffering, especially suffering that is harmonious, we could get into that if we want, but really sort of morally significant is a better way I would put it, is I think far better expected on theism than naturalism once you dive into the weeds of each theory. I think the problem is a lot of times people spend too much time on the surface and not enough time, in the tall grass of metaphysics and stuff like that.
And I think also people just don't really think about that side of the equation, because in the equation, when you said earlier that you're comparing these two theories, that is one side of the equation that you've got to calculate at some point, and people just kind of gloss over that. They spend most of their time thinking about the probability of evil and suffering given theism or given God's existence, and so not as much time is put on the other side. But now let's maybe switch gears and talk about that other side of the equation. How likely is suffering given?
I actually think it can be quite expected. But real quick on your previous point, that's not insignificant, right? Because even if you think that the theist doesn't have a great story, you think, I don't think this is very likely if God exists. If it turns out that the naturalist has a far worse story, then you're still better off going with theism, right? So I just want to emphasize that. All right, so let me give a general, traditional, call it a theodicy, that I think helps us to anticipate a providence, if you will, of suffering like ours. So this is going to be a highly condensed version of a lot of I think, important and technical stuff, but I'll do my best, right? So traditionally, for classical theists, God is the absolute. He is not just the supreme being, he is the supreme good. And God creates. Why does God create? Well, this is an interesting question, because somebody might think, well, if God is perfect and he's pure goodness, then why does he create it all, right? He's just got everything, right? It doesn't seem like there could be any sort of motivation there, right? And what has come out of the tradition, I think, is pretty wise. It says that there's two ways of enjoying one's own goodness. You can rest in it, or you can share it. And that's what the tradition has picked up on, is that little latter aspect, right? That God creates out of an act of pure gratuity, out of an act of pure love, right? That it is good to diffuse being, if you will, to create a natural universe with all different grades of being, a hierarchy of being, and this and that. But God's awesome. He's good. He doesn't want to just give things the gift of existence. I think ultimately God wants to give things the possibility for the best thing that is conceivable, which is union with God, right? To come into union with God, right? Okay, but a lot of things don't seem to be the right sort of thing that can come into union with God. Think about rocks. Like, how does a rock unite with God? It seems to have friendship with God. You need to kind of be a rational animal, right? Something possessed of intellect and will, right? Love is the uniting of two independent free wills, right? Okay, so now I think we have some general reason for why God would create beings like us, human beings. Because when you think about us, we're pretty cool, I think, in the sense that we're sort of a microcosm within the macrocosm. So again, traditionally, human beings are not just rational beings, we're rational animals that seem to be like a concentration of the great chain of being. We have all the lower aspects, right? The material aspects. We also have the higher aspects, right? What people would consider the angelic aspects, sort of concentrated in us. So again, we're sort of this microcosm within the macrocosm. And the idea here is that if God sort of pulls beings like us into union with himself, he sort of drags all of creation along for the ride. I think that's a really cool account, right, of why God would create, and the sort of end of creation, this great, beautiful sort of loop of coming from the source and returning to the source. However, as we indicated before, only God is perfect. Only God is naturally impeccable. Beings like us are fallible in our judgments. We can consider moral rules when making certain decisions. We can also choose not to consider moral rules, and we can sin, and we can introduce disorder into the world. So presumably can higher spiritual entities. So I think God also has very good reason to create a universe that is conducive, an arena, if you will, that is conducive to, call it, moral realization. And moral realization has, I think, two aspects. One is a sort of redemptive or saving aspect, that we want a providence that is sort of optimized, if you will, to save us from becoming truly wicked or evil. But also on the other side, towards the soul building, so call that soul saving, towards a soul building that gives us opportunities to develop and display great virtues, to become not just heroes, but saints. And as it happens, I think that that's sort of the arena that we seem to find ourselves in. We know that a providence of suffering, including intense suffering, is often the best way to get people to turn toward God, to relinquish narcissistic tendencies, to seek out help in moral and spiritual community, to start letting go of obsessions over just finite temporal things that do not deserve to be considered the ultimate good. They can bring us to points of surrender to God and accepting God's grace and then cooperating it as we become holy, and then face further challenges on the road to sort of our moral perfection, where we can then exhibit and develop these tremendous heroic virtues. That seems to be just the sort of world that we're in. Now, people say, well, a lot of random and arbitrary stuff seems to happen too. How do you account for this gratuitous stuff? And I think, again, you have to consider that God has to create a natural order where natures in the general run are allowed to kind of just do their thing without constant intervention. I think if God constantly intervened to prevent bad things from happening, he would undermine the logic of creation. He would create a massively chaotic world, and that's just nonsense. So God has to draw the line somewhere. And I say that because I believe God does intervene, and we don't know how much he does intervene, but he has to have a general policy of actually letting sort of nature run its course. And I think that that can go a long way towards accounting towards presumably, mysterious or gratuitous evils, but also think in God's justice that there has to be some sort of compensation for people who suffer that way. And that would seem to entail something like an account of the afterlife. So yeah, really condensed version, but that's kind of the story I find not just plausible, but actually true.
Yeah, so I think I would have had a lot more difficult time trying to poke holes in the way that you respond to the problem of evil, which is kind of the reason why we're doing this, is because you can always go deeper in any account that you're looking at. But I really appreciate the way that you articulated your response to the problem of evil. And that actually brings me to your book, The Best Argument for God. I've talked about this on my show a bunch, and we've even done like giveaways and stuff for it. And so I want to give you kind of like a 60-second opportunity. And I know that that's kind of difficult because it's like a legitimately thick, nice size book, but do your best to give me like a quick overview, like a 60-second overview of the argument that you provide in here.
Yeah, great. Well, my book is essentially trying to reverse what I consider a very interesting and serious argument against God. And it goes like this. Hey, if two theories explain just as much, believe the simpler theory. Naturalism and theism, they explain just as much, but naturalism is simpler, so let's go with that. So my essential, thesis is that, hold on a minute, I want to say that naturalism can only explain some, but not all of what theism can, but only when strapped with far greater complexity. And that allows me to develop I think a substantial cumulative case for theism, where we not only get into those kind of thorny considerations of simplicity, but also look at all the sort of broad data, or the sort of broad, large-scale, phenomena of the world that worldviews are supposed to explain. Things like contingency, consciousness, rationality, the moral dimension, suffering and evil, and make the case in each chapter, each section, of why I think the theistic account is a superior one. So it's a cumulative case, but it comes down to, a matter of theory comparison.
Nice. All right, one last question. Is Christianity true?
Yes, of course.